Welcome to Fading Causes with me, Mukesh Kapila. My guest describes herself as always landing feet first. Well, in her case, it's literal because she was breech birth, and breech births are dangerous. At the time of her debut on planet Earth, one in four newborns in her Sierra Leone didn't survive. But having survived did not put off my guest from making risky choices later on in life. That's why we are talking today, because I want to ask her, why is she so obtuse? But first, let me welcome Yvette Stevens.
Thank you, Mukesh. I'm very happy to be talking to you.
Yvette, you and I have much in common. We grew up in our respective Sierra Leone and India, and our countries were being wooed at that time by the Soviet Union with scholarships to study. I got offer of a scholarship, but it didn't take me long to reject that in favor of studying in the West. You could have also done that. So why did you choose to go to Moscow and cry into your borscht for a whole year while trying to learn a completely new language and enduring the harsh Russian winters, communist restrictions, and generally struggling? When you could have gone to London, where you had family, where you were already fluent in English and already knew something about the English way of life from your colonial background. So why were you so contrary?
I must say that I was a bit of a rebel. And that's because I kept going to the library and reading and listening to the radio. I followed closely the space race. When I landed in 1961, when Yuri Gagarin went into space, I said, wow, that's what I want to do. I have to go to, I really was keen to go to USSR.
I think it's very interesting because the Cold War was going on at the time that you and I were growing up, uh, and on one hand, you loved learning about the world through the BBC, and you speak very fondly of your British teachers, but you were mesmerized by Soviet science and technology. But in cultural terms, who won the battle for the mind and heart of the young Yvette, Pushkin or Shakespeare? Where did your political and social views eventually settle?
Okay, I've never been interested in politics and I've never had political views as such. My fascination for Russia grew once I got to Russia. My first experience was not good. The teacher came and started Здравствуйте. And then she spoke for 2 whole hours. And we were looking, I said, no, this is crazy. Nobody could understand. She spoke for 2 hours and then said, До свидания. And that was it. She left the class. I never had her speak English. Because I thought I was going to go to embassy there to say, no, no, take me back. I can't take this. But then I said to myself, oh, okay, let me try. And in fact, I would find it humiliating to go back to Sierra Leone. So then I had to stick to it. And surprisingly, I fell in love with the Russian language. So if you ask me Pushkin or Shakespeare, it was Pushkin. I tell you why, because I did Shakespeare in school. So it was something you had to do for exams. But when I was learning Russian, we were allowed to appreciate Russian art. We went to museums, we went to concerts, and I got to like the Russian language very much. And when I also learned that Pushkin was partly African and his Russian was just perfect, ideal, simple, and easy to understand. But then it was very dense in terms of substance that Pushkin was talking about. And I still remember because I ended up even reading Pushkin poems on the television.
I envy that you are able to read Pushkin in the original Russian. I can only read it in English, and I'm sure I'm missing out a lot. My childhood ambition was to be a train driver, but you, from a very youngest age, wanted to be a space scientist, even the first African astronaut. Unfortunately, your Soviet mentor said, "Oh, Africa has other priorities," and they directed you to engineering. So, what did you feel about that? And how did you choose electrical engineering?
At first, I was very disappointed, but then I thought, when I was growing up in town in my country, I used to go to my grandmother in the village. And when it was dark, we used kerosene lamps and candles. I was so sorry for them. So when I could not study space science and they offered me engineering, I said, well, okay, I had always dreamt of doing to help people to have access to electricity. So that's how I took it.
The title of your memoir is Breaking Open Barriers. And I can't imagine greater barriers than a female engineer in a very young country. So how did you break those barriers?
Well, the greatest barriers was getting to study science at all. I was going to a girls' school at the time. We were not taught science subjects. We did something called general science. And then the teacher said to me, "Oh, I think you will do well in science." But I didn't have a choice because I was going to a girls' school. It was only general science. I could not go on to sixth form and do science subjects. This was when I decided to go to a boys' school to do science. And it was provisional because I knew one of the teachers. And when he saw that I was really keen to do science, he went and pleaded for me and then came back to say, "We are going to accept you, but for one term and see how you perform." And that was when I said to myself, "No, I cannot be a woman who has to drop science because she couldn't perform." And I worked so hard. Guess what? I beat the boys. That was when I got confidence you can do science. You have just proven yourself. And so that was the first barrier that I broke. As a woman in the time of seriousness, well, there are some women doing biology and stuff like that, but as a woman doing what I would call the hard science, physics and maths to become an engineer. That was the first one. And then I was very active in the Institution of Engineers. I must say that some of male colleagues are very patronizing. I said to myself, "Yeah, let them patronize you as long as you're learning." So I took advantage of that and tried to learn as much as possible from those who believed that I needed to have their back. Of course, there were incidents. My head of department wasn't quite happy to have me there because I was so assertive and I would argue on technical issues. He didn't like it. And he was very hostile to me. But one thing I always did in my whole life is that I stand for myself. I really did not take it lying down. And I think that is something that I learned in life. If I know that I am qualified to be where I am, then don't tell me that I am a woman and try to run me down because I will stand up for myself.
And is that the advice you would continue to give to today's younger women when they confront the misogyny and
Yes. In fact, it's interesting because at least on two occasions, women who have been put in positions, even when I came as ambassador here, there was a female ambassador who said to me, my staff, they do not respect you. I said, "So, aren't you the boss? Why do you accept it? You just take your stand and you are in charge. So how could you be afraid of the people you are in charge of?" So yes, that's advice I would give every woman in a position of authority. And you're doing the right thing. Don't take it from anybody to run you down.
but first, as a woman, you had to get into a position of authority. Now, today, we have many women in positions of authority, and the world has made progress on gender equality, not as much as we would like, and sometimes it goes backwards. But we do have, within the UN system in particular, greater gender equality, and several agencies are headed by women. Tell me, just because there are more women in the international system, has that made the system, UN in particular, work better, more effectively? Has the world become a better place as a consequence?
Well, I'll be very honest. Merely by being a woman does not guarantee that you are going to perform better than your male counterparts. There are some women who are worse women, but if you look at it generally, women by nature um, tend to be more concerned. Women have that capacity to really understand others and to work system. But I would not say every woman. There are some women who are not. And it's funny talking to you. It just struck me now. Throughout my life, I've never had a female boss. But when I came to the UN, in 1980, we were not many. When I started moving up, it was even worse. In UNHCR, we did not have a woman director. I went to New York, there were 3 or 4 of us in the UN Secretariat who were women at the D2 director level. But that has changed a lot. Okay. And I look at the statistics now. Wow! You look at all the secretariat at the highest levels of Undersecretary General and Assistant Secretary Generals. Women have reached 50%. So something has happened in the UN at least. When you look at the outcome of the Beijing conference, which is over 30 years ago, the recognition of women in many positions has improved considerably. In situations where before you would never dream of a woman, now you have women.
Mhm.
So whether or not they will do better, some will do. It's interesting. I also thought about Africa. We have a country, Namibia, where the three topmost positions are held by women, and we are looking to see how much difference it's going to make. Initial steps are very positive, but I think we would need to prove that women at the top in Africa particularly are going to make a difference that the continent needs. Let's face it.
We need gender equality because we want to create a world of equals. It doesn't follow that all women will be brilliant. We don't judge men's performance either on that basis. And let me ask you, in parallel, there is much greater diversity in international leadership now. Certainly, in the early years, the UN system was European American dominated. We have many more Asians and more Africans in leadership position in many agencies. And of course, we have the African Union, which has grown in importance and strength. Having more Africans, male and female, in international organizations, has that improved the functioning of the multilateral system? And has it been good for Africa?
I hate generalizing on these issues. But basically, we do not have enough to come to any conclusion at this point of time. But you are talking about Africans now.
I'm talking about African solutions for African.
Yes. Well, I believe that we have been too long under the power of our former colonial masters. And the more we have depended on them, it has made us completely helpless in addressing the issues that we face because we are always looking up, for our former colonial masters to tell us what to do. We are not looking at what we need to do without the former colonial masters. What can we do by ourselves? We got so used to the begging bowl, and this is basically the problem that we face in Africa particularly. I'm hoping and praying that what we are seeing now, it's a golden opportunity for us to rethink. It's true many people are going to die as a result of arbitrary and cuts, but maybe it's a good time for us to reflect. And I'm really hoping the leaders of Africa will do that.
Going back for a moment to your childhood, one of the images in my head is of a young Yvette hopping on her toes, barefoot, going to school, and hopping because the tarmac was so hot. You had only one pair of shoes, and you reserved that for your Sunday visits to church. You're obviously a very moral girl, and brought up with a very strong sense of responsibility. But what amused me was that you admitted manufacturing extra offenses.
Mhm.
So, was it because you were actually a boringly good little girl and you wanted to liven up the poor priests? Or was it some shrewd calculation to get divine insurance for the sins you were about to commit?
Well, it was like this. We had a very religious I mean, we grew up and as a Roman Catholic too. So we had to go to confession.
Mm.
Confessions were on Saturday. And the communion, you go to church on Sunday and have the communion. Now we were told that you cannot take the communion if you
Mm.
have a sin that you haven't confessed. And we were so children, 6 years into confession, And as little children, we were so scared about going to hell. So my mom and my aunt and the adults, they would always wait for us to come for confession on Saturday to start asking things that we had denied during the course of the week. Who took that piece of sugar? And then you have to admit that you did take it because you didn't want a sin. Another sin after you have confessed. We saw confession as washing you clean. So, but then I discovered that, well, why don't I just add a few sins when I go to confession? That way, when I tell a lie, I would have paid allowance for that. I mean, there were so many things, little things that we made us believe that everything you did was a sin in the cinema in front of the church. So when you come from confession, you are seeing these billboards, these women that half dressed. We thought we shouldn't look at it because we'll be committing a sin. So we start walking along the street and turning the other way around so you will not commit a sin. But anyway, yes. I mean, so that was why I always added one or two.
Well, I'm fascinated by that because I was thinking, you know, your childish attitude towards sin and redemption and the fears you had of hell as per what you were taught. How does it translate into modern geopolitics? The sins nations commit against each other, and then the confessional is, for example, the forums of the United Nations. People are told, countries are told, well, you've done that wrong. You abused this human right or that human right. You invaded that country. So it just got me thinking, really, about how this was a little parable of the world we live in today. But moving on, you got married into a top political family. I don't think you got married thinking it's a top political family. You
Mhm.
just fell in love.
Yeah.
And your father in law was Siaka Stevens. He was part of the team that negotiated Sierra Leone's independence from Britain. And he became prime minister and then country's first president. And he served 18 years in various leadership positions, including head of state. Commentators now characterize his rule as violent, self indulgent, consolidating power through corruption and exploitation. And he wasn't unique in terms of leaders in many countries in Africa and elsewhere. Of course, you can't be held responsible for your father in law's sins, but how did that familial connection with a person in power affect you and your subsequent life?
Yeah. First of all, just one thing about my father-in-law. I mean, my marriage lasted for only 8 years, but my father-in-law basically was somebody who came from a minority group. Now, my father-in-law during his time, he was criticized a lot because he had this one party. Everybody said one party is not democratic. But that was the time that we enjoyed peace in Sierra Leone. The moment we broke all this and we started party fights, that's when we started having the problem. That's when we had the 11-year war. So basically, I respected him a lot in terms of keeping the country, I mean, peaceful during his time. Now, I tell you something, and it's not because it's my father in law. I think he's the only African president who died a pauper. Never had any money. Everybody accused him of corruption, but, he never, I could tell you that for sure. He never had, he died a pauper because the person he had put in power then decided to ostracize him. And basically, it was a sad story. But to come back to your question, yes, my marriage lasted 8 years only, but I ended up with the name Stevens associated with my father in law, Shaka Stevens. Now, the problem we have in Sierra Leone and in most African countries is that is what I would call ethnic. Sierra Leone decided to open its first mission in Geneva. The then president asked, I need somebody with UN experience. And by then I had 28 years and he made me ambassador. I tell you, if it was not his party in power, I would never have been made ambassador, even if I created the UN. So
Right.
basically, the ethnic, the old stigma, if you call it, that I hold as being a Stevens and associated with Shaka Stevens has not bode well when the party that he belongs to has not been in power. So basically, this is linked to the ethnic problem. The parties are all along ethnic lines anyway. In Sierra Leone, it's so blatant. So basically, being associated with a party is held by a particular ethnic group made it easy for me sometimes, but then when that particular party was not in power, made it impossible for me to do anything for my country.
I think you have answered my next question, which was how come that Sierra Leone, which had so much promise when it became independent, how it messed it up? So you're saying that uh, ethnic divisions have been at the foundation of Sierra Leone's troubles, a terrible conflict, and I saw it for myself during my many visits to Sierra Leone. If that's the case, then, and the same is maybe true for other countries in Africa, what hope for the future?
No, but in Sierra Leone, the conflict was not ethnic, even though we had the ethnic problems. The conflict was out of greed of some people who saw this as a means of having access to diamond resources. So actually, we were lucky because ethnic conflicts are not easy to resolve. But again, some of the problems which our continent faces is
Right.
that of leadership. We have not been lucky to have the right leaders who would put the country before their ethnic affiliations and their personal gains. But what makes things even worse, Mukesh, is that democracy, as being understood in Africa, basically boiled down to elections every 4 to 5 years. When there's an election in Sierra Leone and I'm being congratulated, Sierra Leone is democratic. We had 4 general elections since the war. I said, yeah, we did have elections, but look closely into it. And also in many African countries, most of the upheavals we've had are in preparation for elections. Because and then I ask, be honest with myself, are the elections basically the sort of democracy as defined? Because the elections only bring back ethnic enmities, and people spend time worrying about the next elections. My country had elections in 2023. The next elections are scheduled for 2028. But guess what? All the news that I open every day from for all the parties is they are fighting for who should be the leader for the 2028 elections. The government, the party got now. The members of that party are busy fighting every day as who should be the next flag bearer. And in all these fights, you forget about what you're there for. Basically, for me, if anybody should ask me whether to be democratic, we have to base it only on election, I would say I don't believe it. Because I also tell you, Mukesh, I've been doing a lot of reflections. Take the example of Singapore. Did they have elections did they change their leaders every 5 years? At independence, we were at the same level as Malaysia, as Singapore. Those countries have not stopped. We are just blindly, and because we love the idea of every 5 years, because there's an opportunity that our own ethnic group is going to come into power. So we are busy doing all our efforts into that. We are not looking to get the best leaders that will address the problems. We are the leader who, when he's president, I could go to beg to pay my students school fees, etc. So that is not boding well for the continent.
So, are you saying that Africans are not ready for democracy? Are you saying that actually the model of democracy that is being practiced around Africa, for the reasons you eloquently said, doesn't work? So, are you suggesting that authoritarianism, and some would say that Singapore has a quasi authoritarian style of governance, is better for Africa? Like, for example, under President Stevens, your father in law.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if democracy is defined as having elections every 5 years, I have problems with that, because that does not guarantee democracy. But that seems to be the way that for the African continent, democracy is being defined. And why I brought in the Singapore example, Mukesh, now, if let's say my country had a leader like Singapore had, and the country was moving forward, would we then say after 5 years, we go into an election process, which is going to be fought on ethnic grounds, and bring another person who first thing he thinks about is getting rich, filling his pockets, and not necessarily having the interest of the development of country at mind? So if we are considered democratic because we have elections every 5 years, but we are not progressing at all, then excuse me.
I get it. I get it. But then who's accountable? Countries get the governments they deserve. Are you saying that the people of Sierra Leone and countries are to blame for the bad governments they have elected? To exploit the population is the other way around, that people are stupid enough or naive enough or greedy enough to believe in promises from ambitious leaders and elect bad governments.
No, but if you had a good leader, Kesh, who is seen to be putting the interests of the country before everything else, I think you would get a good following. But our friends that we have in Africa goes back to the Berlin Conference of 1885, in which the borders of Africa were done on a map. What this map did was it cut across ethnic lines, because before this conference, there were kingdoms in Africa which got together ethnic groups. But these artificial boundaries that were set up cut across lines and forced people from different ethnic groups to live together. Now, when the OAU was created, they acknowledged this was a problem for Africa. but it was inconceivable to withdraw the frontiers established. So the expectation is that different groups within countries will learn to live with each other. But in all the many years since the 1962 or so, when this happened, it hasn't happened everywhere. If you look at Africa, Mukesh, the countries that have done well have been the countries where, by some stroke of luck, the ethnicities within that country have been uniform or almost uniform. All the first leaders promoted unity. Botswana, for instance, and Mauritius, if you come to West Africa, Ghana, those are the countries that have been stable. But the other countries, that ethnic problem has never gone. Look at Kenya. Every time there is an election, we see what happens between the different ethnic groups. Political parties are on ethnic lines in many countries in Africa. It's interesting, one party system was completely condemned in my country. Shaka Stevens proclaimed one party, criticized by everybody, but he brought together everybody from different ethnic groups. And that was the best time we've had in terms of unity. But
I mean, I'm sure the debate will carry on. I wonder for how many more decades are you going to blame colonialism of the past, the problems of today? But leaving that aside, let me come to the important point you made, which is of leadership and finding a leader who can ride above these divisions. Where are these leaders? Why isn't Africa producing more such leaders?
I'm not blaming colonialism. I'm telling you that we have just failed in Africa to bring different groups together in many countries. This political struggle between them has been there. Now, where do you find these leaders? It is not impossible. The reason why we do not have the leaders we should have is because we select our leaders on ethnic grounds. It is
Mhm.
not based on merit. It is just that. And even now, I mean, I'm laughing because when I talk about one party state, just yesterday they were talking in Sierra Leone about government of national unity. Well, I don't know, Mukesh, maybe you know more than I do. I'm asking myself, so how is that different from a one party? I don't know.
Moving to your other distinguished career, you worked in the UN for many years in organizations like WTO, ILO, OCHA, and such like. And then you became ambassador for Sierra Leone in Geneva. And that's where I got to know you well over recent years. Thinking of that building in which your embassy is based, and I visited it many times because there are other countries based there, small countries. Is there not a two-tier diplomacy setup weighted in favor of the bigger voices in international affairs who have big embassies? You see that you drive around Geneva and you see their mansions and their hundreds of staff. Then you come to small African countries like Sierra Leone, and you're lucky if the poor ambassador has an assistant or a receptionist. So, do you think the international diplomatic system is weighted in favor of the bigger powers?
Well, yes, I would say it's weighted. One thing you have to say is that in the UN, every country is treated equally. General Assembly, every country has one vote. I mean, the voice, the possibility is given, equal opportunity is given. But you're right. The bigger countries, by virtue of having many more people in their missions, they're in a have a greater capacity to participate. But the way I addressed it, coming from a small country, and I always say this and people laugh, if you think you are too small to make a difference, you haven't slept in a room with a mosquito one night. The first thing the small countries need to do is to identify their priorities. And they have to strategize. Yes, so many things are happening and you can be overwhelmed by it. But the experience I had was that in the areas identified as priorities, even the countries with the large delegations did not have a bigger voice than me. And for the other priority areas, I depended a lot on the African group because the African group works very well.
Give an example of how your little voice
Mhm.
was perhaps effective.
Well, when Ebola went to West Africa, it was in Guinea. It was very close to my country, so I panicked. I went to WHO and I met with the Deputy Director General. And I said, look, I'm very worried. Ebola is next to my country. What are you doing? He smiled and said, you need not worry. We are handling it. And then every day, more people were dying. The outbreak came to Sierra Leone. And then people were dying. The doctors were dying. And then I read in the newspaper, the German doctor who said, Ebola is now in 3 countries. The international community should just forget about these 3 countries and concentrate on the neighboring countries. So I said, "What? You telling me you're writing my country off?" So I went to those who were there at the time. They'll tell you the amount of noise I made, and I eventually convinced the then Director General Margaret Chan to bring the whole issue to the member states to a member states briefing. And I tell you, that was remarkable because even though countries have heard about the Ebola in Geneva, where all countries have their humanitarian representatives, they did not know much about it. It had been held in WHO as a health emergency. So I succeeded in making it a humanitarian emergency. And that's led to a lot of support to address the disease. That was just one example of where my small voice made a lot of difference.
I remember that time very well. I visited Sierra Leone, I visited Liberia, and it was an existentialist crisis. The WHO were rightly criticized that the organization did not respond fast or definitively enough, even though our mutual friend, the late lamented David Nabarro, tried very hard. But it led to a significant change in the way WHO operates in emergencies. I guess that's one of the legacies of your small voice influencing the way international organizations behave and the attitudes they take. And we see that reflected, for example, in the pandemic discussions that have taken place since then. Coming to your other UN organizations, say in ILO or in UNHCR in East Africa, any examples of the difference you made?
Well, I was chief of the program and technical support section, responsible for setting up camps and settlements in refugee situations. When I came first as the head, this section was only consulted by the bureaus. It was never given a role. And that was another fight. I've succeeded to say that this is where your technical experts are located, and they should be given from the word go. And even in terms of contingency planning, they should be given a role. And that did happen in UNHCR at the time, so that was something I thought I had contributed to. In ILO, I had a little story because when I went to a mission to my country, I got to this village in which they were expecting a blue-eyed white male ILO expert. And then I appeared as ILO expert. And I was speaking their language. I was dancing because in our villages you dance when guests come. And then when we got to the community center, the chief said, "So where's the expert?" And then they said, "This is your expert here." And he said, "Oh," he was really surprised. And he said to the women, he said, "You see, a woman from this country is coming to us as an eye expert. You have to make sure you send your girls to school." And I tell you, the next day there was a whole queue of girls going to school. But one thing that he said to me that I kept me going always said, "Okay, you are from us. You have come to us. We have given you all the information. If you do not come back to help us, we leave it with your conscience."
Hmm. Hmm.
And I must say, throughout my stay in the UN, I always thought about what that chief told me. I always felt that it was not just enough to say you're a UN staff, but what are you doing to the people that you're supposed to be in charge of?
I also remember when you were in East Africa, one of your staff members was badly treated by the Somali community. When you protested, the community chief offered your wronged staff member either a camel or a wife in compensation.
Mhm.
So, what did you decide?
Okay. Well, that matter came to the to the UN group. So the first thing I said was, they said, "Okay, this man has apologized, so let's just accept it." I said, "No, no, 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 no." The Somali said, "No, no, 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 no. That's what encourage other people to do the same. You have to take what we're offering." And I looked at the guy who was there, and I just got a feeling that he probably wanted the wife. So I solved it. I said, "Okay, so we have the camel," and the camel was given, and it was put in the compound of UNCTAD. Actually, in Somalia, it was put there, and it was providing milk for the staff.
Mhm. Right. Now, on more serious matters, in humanitarian history books are written, the Indian Ocean tsunami will feature strongly. You were in a very important position when the tsunami struck. You were the director of the humanitarian office in Geneva, the humanitarian capital of the world. We all know what happened in the tsunami, but what's the legacy? What changes did the world make or the UN system make as a consequence of the humanitarian response to the tsunami?
Well, actually, my boss then, Ian Egland, had, even before the tsunami had started, had the intention of having a review of the whole humanitarian response system. And when the tsunami occurred, and we saw some of the problems coming out clearly. Everybody was going, every humanitarian organization, UN organization were going with their own programs that were not coordinated. So Ian Egland put me in charge of the humanitarian response review, which was to see how the humanitarian community could better coordinate its assistance to people in need. As a result of that, we came out with a cluster approach, which was trying to bring together um, NGOs, governments, UN organizations working on the same theme to cooperate in a more effective way, rather than each one trying to fight, to struggle, to compete with each other.
So basically, the chaos of the tsunami response helped to shape a more systematic cooperation amongst the UN agencies and others, and improved, therefore, the response.
Yes.
I think that's a suitable legacy. Uh, Yvette, we've discussed many serious issues, but it would not be right without to end this interview without referring to the playful side of your character. You actually have a wicked sense of humor. I have seen that for myself in the many, many very serious meetings when you bring the house down. Like, I remember you once told me, because I had a flu or something and was complaining of my aches and pains, and you said that when you wake up in the morning and your arms and legs ache, you give thanks because at your age, that means that you're still alive, that you
Yes.
survived the night to hurt another day. I found that terribly amusing, but also quite comforting when enduring my own pains and aches. But not being too morbid about it, and in the spirit of lightness, as we finish our conversation, I know that you have been thinking about your final exit.
Mhm.
What's your greatest concern, and what are your final instructions as you prepare to go to the ultimate forum in another place?
Yeah. Mukesh, when you're getting to almost 80 and friends around you are dying, at some point you said, yes, I'm close to that too. So I better prepare myself. Even if I believe my health is good, I talk about it a lot. For instance, my will is not updated, but which is very important. But one thing which I really put right down in writing is that when I am being dressed to put in my coffin, everything has to be coordinated. Everything, the colors should be coordinated. That is something I have done all my life. I have always dressed well coordinated with my colors. And I joke with my children. I said, if you put me in the coffin and I'm not coordinated, I'm going to turn in my grave and come back to haunt you. So basically, just on the light side. But also, I realize that nowadays you have to put things in order. Otherwise, so before you actually die. But I saw that I bought a folder on the internet which says when I die. So when I looked at the contents, I said, this is reasonable. You have your will in it, you have all your accounts in it, you have your insurance, you even have your passwords in it. It is practical to have that. So you put less stress on your survivors when you die.
You know, for a little girl who only had one pair of shoes to be used on Sunday, I hope you don't mind me saying that I haven't seen a lady with so many high heels and colorful combinations as I have had the privilege to witness in the meetings we've been together. I'm confident that you should not have any worries on the aesthetics of your final journey, which I sincerely hope will not be too soon. Meanwhile, Yvette, your story is an inspiration for all who dare to dream in color, despite the black and gray of their daily lives. It's a testimony to your mother's philosophy, who once said to the barefoot Yvette, it's not so much about what you have or don't have, but how you use it. Yvette Elizabeth Stevens, engineer, ambassador, UN official, and much, much more. Thank you for being my most colorful guest on fading causes.
Thank you, Mukesh. It's been a joy speaking to you on the issues I am most interested in.